I'd like to introduce Imam Muhsin to address the question that I've asked in relation to, again, an overview from the Quran about passages that are related to LGBTIQ plus people.
Hi, good evening, everybody. It's morning in South Africa. Well, firstly, I want to just share my appreciation for being part of this seminar. And I have already listened to Kim and Anthony speaking, and I'm like, oh my God, this is so similar in the Quran as well. So I'm Imam Muhsin Hendricks. I'm from Cape Town, and I currently run an organization called Al Ghurba Foundation, which is an organization that gives support to queer Muslims, helping them to reconcile their faith with their sexual orientation and gender identity. So I have done my Islamic studies many years back. That reveals my age. And I come with that knowledge and also my background in counseling and communications. So what I want to share with you today is sort of more conversational. I don't want to bore you with all the verses in the Quran about sexuality and gender. But suffice to say is that when we look at the issue of, let's say, homosexuality in Islam, it is important that we look at all the sources that the classical scholars have taken the information from and formulated their judgments around. So there's this sort of hierarchy of sources in Islam. First, we consult the Quran. It is our first book of reference. And then it is the hadith, which is the purported sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his actions. And then there is ijma, which is the consensus of the classical scholars and their opinions, called ra'i. And then there is the analytical reasoning, right, qiyas. And so we find that when we look at the Quran, that the Quran is actually silent about sexual orientation. And the Quran also doesn't speak about homosexuality in terms of an orientation or an identity, but rather speaks of homosexuality in terms of behavior. And I think when the classical scholars have done their work around, these verses and interpreting them, they have sort of not had the information about sexual orientation and gender identity because it's really a 21st century issue. So I would want to start out by saying that it is important that we make a differentiation between sexual orientation and homosexual orientation and homosexual behavior. So when we look at the Quran does talk about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's called Qawmul Lut, or the people of Lot. And there's about 96 verses spread over 10 different chapters that speaks about this issue. And so one of the things we know when we study the interpretation of the Quran is that you cannot take one particular verse out of context, right? Every verse has a context, right? Because it spoke to Muhammad, peace be upon him, as guidance for what he was going through. So there is a context behind that. But somehow we forget the context. And out of these 96 verses, we only see that there are 3 verses that deals with sexual interactions or homosexual interactions. But what is important is to understand that the Quran was revealed, parts of it in Mecca, the birthplace of Islam, and the latter part was in Medina when the Prophet has migrated to Medina. And all these 96 verses were revealed in the Makki period, in the Makkah period. So Makkah verses did not deal with sexuality. Makkah verses dealt mostly with idolatrous worship, with giving support to the Prophet, peace be upon him, for when he needed guidance on social issues, and stories of previous prophets. So we can already see from there that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not God wanting to instruct us about sexuality, but sort of more how did these idolatrous worship or idolatrous beliefs and practices influence society or had a detrimental effect on society. So I want to focus on these three verses that speaks about sexual behavior. One of the main verses is, if I may quote the Arabic, it says, إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالِ وَتَقْطَعُونَ السَّبِيلَ وَتَأْتُونَ فِي نَادِيكُمُ الْمُنكَرَ. Right? So it kind of just sums up what these atrocities were. So the first thing is the Quran says, you are approaching males, right? And so the Quran is not clear about who the perpetrators are. The Quran is not clear about who are the victims. It just sort of gives us the, an overview. So we really have to dig into our history and do our research to find out what really happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. So what we find is that one of the bigger atrocities that the inmates of Sodom and Gomorrah have, been guilty of was the fact that they were xenophobic. They did not respect the law of hospitality of Abram, peace be upon him. And they felt that, they had the wealth, and why should they share this with wayfarers or travelers passing through their lands? And so they started this practice of, stamping people out of these societies through using sex as power. And so we see what happens on these highways of trade, where the Quran says, they taqta'una sabil, they used to cut off the highways of trade. They used to rob the caravans that passed through these cities, and then molested the men, right? And so already here we see that this has got nothing to do with sexual orientation. This has got to do with men behaving badly. It's not even anything to do with homosexuality per se. And then the second thing that the Quran reminds us in this verse is that وَتَأْتُونَ فِي نَادِيكُمُ الْمُنْكَرَ, and then in your circles also you create these atrocities. So I kind of went in and looked at what were some of these atrocities that happens within these circles. And these circles, it was really the temples that they have set up, these idolatrous temples. And they used to make rules around sexuality and gender, but purely for the benefit of the elite, of the patriarchs. And so within these circles, one of the things that they've instituted was that the main goddess is the goddess of Ishtar. And she was the goddess of fertility and the goddess of love and war. And so whenever there was a harvest, they would celebrate it in this temple, the temple of Ishtar. And so the men would have orgies with one another, or sex with one another, and they would then take the sperm and they would actually smear it onto these gods as a sort of an offering of their fertility to the goddess Ishtar, in turn for the goddess to make their lands fertile. So we see that some of these practices were also related to the agriculture, because they were an agricultural society. And so there again is another example of how homosexuality, this is not about homosexual orientation or identity, but again, it's about behavior related to idolatrous worship. And then the final thing that happened, sort of putting the cherry on top, is when the angels of God, disguised as men, comes to Lot as guest, and asking Lot to, or telling Lot that they are about to destroy these people. And Lot then, protects them in his house. And apparently his wife then betrayed him, and she went to go and tell the people that Lot is entertaining guests. And so this is where the Quran says, that they were rushing towards Lot's house, demanding that Lot should give up his guests. And the Quran used specific words like وَلَقَدْ رَاوَضُوا عَنْ ضَيْفِهِ, that they clearly saying that they were trying to seduce or molest the angels of God. And here we see Lot in a catch-22 because he's trying to protect himself, or sorry, the angels of God. But on the other hand, he's also trying to protect his daughters that they wanted him to sort of offer up to them for temple prostitution, because that was also something that was rife at the time. And so he's kind of struggling. We see in the last few verses, he's kind of struggling to protect both. And then at the point where he says, here are my daughters, they are better for you, for your temple prostitution than what you want to do to the angels of Allah. And that it is at that point where the angel steps in and sort of said to Lot, we think you did a good job, but we need to take over and, do what we were sent to do. So that sort of ends off the story. So I think the important thing to take away from what the Quran talks about is the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. And as I said, the Quran is silent about sexual orientation, and where there's silence, there is consent, according to the Islamic jurisprudence, the fiqh of Islam. And so that sort of gives us an overview of the Quran. But the problem really lies with how the scholars of the 9th century have sort of formulated their opinions around homosexuality and transgenderism and so on. And it is unfortunate that the mainstream views have sort of been passed on to us. And those really critical voices have been marginalized. And here I'm talking about scholars like Imam al-Nawawi from the 9th century, the famous jurist Abu Bakr al-Jassas from the 9th century, and also Imam Abu Hanifa, who formed the Hanafi school of thought. These were three very liberal scholars, and all three of them have sort of made a distinction between the mukhannath min khalqin and mukhannath bitakalluf. So the mukhannath min khalqin was considered the person who was naturally effeminate, naturally had inclinations towards the same sex and so on, in the manner of speech and the dressing was all sort of effeminate. And they all concluded there is no blame on this person, there is no punishment for it. But then there was the muhannath bitakalluf, the one who, the constructed homosexuality. And so if we look at constructed homosexuality in our time today, we look at, for example, rent boys and hustlers and some, I mean, if we look at an example of South Africa, and I'm sure this happens in many other places around the world, where straight boys are actually offering sex to gay guys because they are easy targets, just to feed their drug habits. So they engage in homosexual activities, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a homosexual identity. We also see constructed homosexuality in prisons, for example, where men sort of mark their territory by sort of molesting other men in jail and so on. And there are a couple of other examples as well. So I think that if we want to resolve the issue within Islam, we have to be able to make a distinction between homosexual identity and homosexual behavior. So I don't know how much time I have left, but I will leave it at that. And maybe just to end off by saying that there are a few verses in the Quran that sort of gives us an indication that God has created this diversity and that we have to respect this diversity. And God says, وَيَزِيدُ فِي خَلْقِ مَا يَشَاءُ, and then we create, our creation as diverse as we want to, and it will continue until the day of judgment. So we cannot exclude sexual orientation and gender identity from that diversity. And so there's one beautiful verse in the Quran that says, قُلْ كُلُّ يَعْمَلُ عَلَى الشَّاكِلَةِ فَرَبُّكُمْ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنْ هُوَ أَهْدَى سَبِيلًا. That say that we are all acting according to our own inclinations, our own dispositions, right? And God knows best who is guided on the way. So, kind of saying that we cannot judge, and especially not based on something that is innate to people. It is God ultimately that is the judge.
Mm.
Thank you.